I haven't made a challenge video in a while. That's because I didn't make any of my previous ones for the sake of the challenge itself. When I make a Can You Beat video, it's because I want an excuse to replay a game. Sadly, until recently, I haven't played a VR game that made me want to immediately jump back in right after beating it. That all changed when I finally got around to playing Vertigo Remastered. Going into Vertigo, I wasn't expecting much. I knew it was an updated version of one of the first VR games with a real campaign, but beyond that detail, I was going in blind. It was that much more surprising then when I discovered that I was to play as a beautiful little POC with no legs and two gargantuan white balls. The introduction went by without much of impact happening, and I ran into a funny looking fella that's surely popular with Japanese ladies. I found myself being sucked into a big black ball, and when I came out on the other side, I was thrilled to find something even more exciting than white or black balls. As I went through this opening level for the second time, I couldn't help but note that all of my favorite VR games take place in a futuristic setting where shit has hit the fan, and you're plopped right smack dab in the middle of said shit. I also couldn't help but notice how much inspiration Stress Level 0 must have taken from Vertigo. Abandoned scientific research facility? Check. Horrible working conditions for the employees at said research facility? Check. Buttons that you could smack the shit out of? Check. After my observations that totally didn't ignore the inspiration for both of these games, I found the weapon I'd be using to complete this video's challenge. I'm not really sure what the official name for this weapon is, so for simplicity's sake, I'll refer to it as a baton for the rest of the video. The awesome looking particle effect the devs were able to pull off for the baton that YouTube's compression will surely have a field day with awed me for a few seconds before I had to get to work. I confirmed that buttons could be pressed with any item in my hands, got distracted by the particle effects again, and stumbled on the first of these funny little guys. I'm not sure of their name, and since I'm too lazy to Google it, I'll just refer to them as silly little fellas from this point on. I was heartbroken on my first playthrough to discover the bigger alien species that I am also too lazy to look up the name for were not friends. But I was happy to discover that the devs knew that good-looking breakable glass is one of the most important parts of any good VR game, and I couldn't help myself from seeing where the dark, moist tunnel I came across led. The first weird, sweaty hand man I came across since that one time in the Arby's parking lot in 2012 ended up being a snack for Vertigo Remastered's first boss. In the interest of being fully honest with you, the first time I played this game ended with me getting frustrated with this boss battle and giving up on the game for half a year. The battle itself isn't hard by any means, but having to do the same action over and over and over again just for a relatively disappointing death animation made me think that this game wasn't worth my time back then. Luckily, I ended up giving it another chance, and I'm very glad I did so. Next, I picked up the second weapon you get your hands on and immediately stashed it away, never to be seen again. I came across a large, open area that was clearly meant to wow early VR gamers with its scale, but I ended up moving through it relatively quickly. If it wasn't for this relatable robot, I might not have even included this section of the game in the video. The opening hour of Vertigo Remastered gives off a pretty disappointing impression, and I ended up having to make my own fun with out-of-bounds shenanigans and Family Guy references. It's a real shame because the rest of the game is incredibly fun and visually unique, especially for a VR game as old as it is. The death of the Walmart version of the Iron Giant marked the end of the only really boring section of the game, and I moved on to greener pastures. I found a tunnel that all but convinced me at least one of Stress Level 0's designers was a big fan of Vertigo Remastered, and came across what I'd hoped would be this game's equivalent of a head crab. The funky little robot dog thing had the jumping part of a head crab down, but it just wasn't as cute without the meaty slaps and varicose veins that make head crabs my precious little babies. I moved on and stumbled on what I had hoped was a friendly alien, but I ended up just pulling it out of whatever trance it had been in. Fortunately, the smaller aliens were still cute and harmless, and I refused to hurt a hair on their tiny little head body things. I stumbled onto another handyman that had no better luck than the first and was able to test my baton's ability to return to sender. For something that's the centerpiece of this challenge, the baton is a relatively simple piece of technology. It can do just about everything you would expect from a futuristic generic brand lightsaber, and nothing much else. Fortunately, to make up for the boring arsenal the game had given me up to this point, I finally stumbled on the first real standout section of Vertigo. Again, I couldn't help but draw comparisons between VR games that came after Vertigo's release, and the little black goo monster stuck in these glass enclosures conjured up images of other cute things stuck in jars. I rounded a corner and found myself face to eye with the second boss of the game and stumbled into an all too familiar situation. Normally, this boss is beaten by shooting it in the eye with 3 stationary cannons scattered across the arena. In fact, this section is rather easy to get through on a normal playthrough. You just teleport from debris to debris, fight off a few tentacles, and shoot him in the eye 3 times. Since I've run into a similar roadblock in a previous challenge, I knew that I needed to check a few things before I used the cannons. To not void the challenge completely, I had to make sure there was no other way for me to pop this sucker with my baton. A few experiments and some frustrating rug pulls later, I made my way back to the cannons and finished the fight. The obstacles that the game threw at me thrilled me my first time through this fight, but they all seemed rather pointless for this playthrough. Some good did come out of this boss fight though. I was given a buddy to accompany me on the rest of my journey. I'm pretty sure he has an official name somewhere in the achievements, but I don't care about that, so I'll call him Gumpy for the rest of this challenge. The next enemy I ran into might get this video demonetized, but there are some risks you just have to take to make it big in this world. For some reason I can't remember while I write the script for this video, and totally not because of my abusive handling of Gumpy, I had to load a previous save. When I did, Gumpy tried to make a break for it, and I used my gun for the first and last time of this playthrough. To make up for my abuse, I booked some tickets for a fun tram ride and promptly fell off the platform, much like my channel has fallen off these last few months. As I was riding an elevator up to the next section of the game, I noticed an amazing detail I hadn't caught in my first playthrough. The displays throughout the game actually simulate a large display made up of RGB pixels, which I think is pretty damn neat. I gave Gumpy a quick existential crisis and tried to make it up to him by giving him a bath. Moving on, I ran through a new enemy type that was guarding yet another bit of my arsenal that I wouldn't be able to use. The rifle is cool and the variable scope function feels really smooth in a normal playthrough, but it's not nearly as cool as good gun safety. Next, I came across an enemy that was much more intimidating in my first playthrough, but felt like little more than a candyless piñata in this one. At the top of the elevator, I opted to take a brief pacifistic route that was cut short by a robot that just wanted to play God's chosen pastime. Just like a good American father, I reminded him that I didn't have time to play and that I hated him. Keeping the theme going, I introduced Gumpy to a new friend, and subsequently beat him to death for being too grumpy. As I pulled up to an apparently bulletproof ski lift, I couldn't help but wish I was fishing instead of completing this challenge. The game must have heard my prayers, because it teased me with the sight of a cozy little dock before throwing me into the thick of things with yet another easily cheesed mini-boss. After I introduced his shiny ass to the nice soft grass, I skipped on down to the dock I had seen from the ski lift and got to fishing. Just like with any other great fishing trip, I blacked out with little to no memory of my previous exploits and woke up with a headache, surrounded by a nasty green bog, and damning evidence of what the authorities refer to as driving under the influence. After my bender, I needed to escape this virtual reality with a bit of virtual reality. But it was all a little too meta for me, so I decided it would be better to depose a local educator and go on a 20-minute rant about why you need to like this video and send it to your hot 20-something-year-old sister. After letting off that steam, I ran into a nasty little robot that did not approve of Gumpy and had to be put in his place. A little down the hall, I got my first good scare in VR in who knows how long, and was disappointed when editing this clip to find out that my recording software had picked up the wrong mic. Next began the first section of the game I actually struggled to get through with only a baton. The amount of enemies crammed into tight corridors filled with gas that discouraged close combat seemed to be the perfect storm of obstacles for this challenge, and I actually ended up dying a couple times to something besides me being a dumbass. Fortunately, the onslaught of annoying enemies was eventually replaced by a room filled with epic little fellers, who still seemed completely disinterested in me or Gumpy. I then squeezed into a matter compressor that made me experience life through the eyes of someone shorter than 5'8". My adventures in dwarfdom were scary at first.
Whoa! Shit.
But after a few interactions with comically large keycards and buttons, I was relieved to see a familiar face. While I don't necessarily believe in karma, I was glad that I had treated these now not-so-little guys with respect in our previous encounters. Ignoring a human ribcage and the disturbing implications of its existence, I found what I assumed to be one of my friend's larvae and introduced him to Gumpy. After some one-handed vine swinging, which, no, isn't a euphemism, I found a few prickly parents who didn't like me rescuing their babies from dank ribcage pools. After treating their baby with the respect it deserved, I was informed by the universe that I might want to be a little more polite to the alien life around me. Of course, like a true American, I opted to distract myself with a puzzle and shove alien babies into glowing metal holes. The rest of this section saw me finding more puzzle pieces and babies and trying to remember where I needed to deposit them, and again being reminded that I was not entirely safe in these tunnels. As if to confirm my concerns over my safety, shoving the last few larvae I found lying around into the techno door revealed a cage, made of human bones. Luckily, just as I started to get the heebie-jeebies, Gumpy and I retreated to a nice song and dance number and deposited onto a nice soft pile of bones. The third big boss of the game was none other than the mom from every Yo Mama joke uttered since the mid-90s, and she was a pain in the ass to beat. I edited out a lot of swinging, but this fight went on so long that I started to fear that I wasn't doing any damage with my baton. My tedious work did pay off, and I watched something that felt wrong to witness in VR. After falling into an obvious pit of darkness, I was finally returned to my normal size, and moved on to the last few sections of the game. It had been so long since I had seen a robot that I had forgotten how exactly I fought them, so I gave Gumpy a shot at clearing the area ahead. The rest of this area was a maze of levers needing to be pulled, enemies to smack, and giant floating alien creatures needing to be ogled. After a bit more smacking and ogling, I found myself face to face with a minecart, and more exciting to my inner child, the mines. A lever that you would normally need to shoot to head on the right track might have posed an obstacle to this challenge, but I was happy to find out that the developers had thought about people like me and continued on down the line. One kaboom and an elevator ride later, I found myself facing down the most tedious level of any game I've ever encountered in my life. In a normal playthrough, this simple arena is meant to make you feel badass. It's slightly challenging, sure, but the game giving you waves of enemies to cut down with your newly acquired minigun is meant to be a power trip to cap off the smaller skirmishes you've encountered leading up to this fight. I did not get to experience that power trip. I died a lot. Every time I thought I had made some progress through 2, 3, 5 waves of enemies, they just kept coming, and I just kept dying. There were simply too many enemies to handle with this simple baton. And the fact that the autosave brought me back to the beginning of the fight started to drive me up a wall. After one death too many, I remembered something that I'd hoped wouldn't have to come up in this challenge. You see, this game has 3 levels of difficulty. The first time I beat Vertigo, I did so on normal difficulty, like I do with every other first go-around of every other game I've played. I didn't want to resort to this, but I lowered the difficulty to easy for the rest of this fight. Even then, it wasn't a free win. I still had to use cheesy tactics to get through most of the waves, and I still died once or twice. Finally though, just when the footage for this video was about to never see the outside of my hard drive, I killed the last enemy. I had never been so happy to finish a level in any VR game before this, and I confirmed once and for all that a VR Soulsborne game would be hell on earth. After that ordeal, the rest of the game was a walk in the park. Outside of a little outrage over the game lying about how I had gotten through the Eternal fight before, I found the last area to be a breeze to get through. I started out trying to figure out how to deal with the enemies far out of my baton's reach, but quickly realized that I could just run past the few remaining enemies of the game and press one last button. Gumpy and I ascended. My first time through Vertigo Remastered, I had expected a little more out at the end of the game. I'd hoped for one more introduced mechanic or trick up the game's sleeve, but as soon as I had stepped on this last elevator, I was done. A character that I hadn't run into the whole game was there to give me some expository dialogue, but I was too focused on telling you, dear person that stayed until this point in the video, that you can indeed beat Vertigo Remastered with just a baton. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, these Can You Beat challenges have been pretty sparse because I haven't played many VR games that I thought were worthy of a whole entire playthrough for the sake of one video. Vertigo Remastered was, and having just beat Half-Life 2 in VR and in general for the first time, I think it's safe to say more Can You Beat videos are to come in the future. Hopefully with the launch of the Quest 3, these videos will look a little better in the future as well, but there's no way of knowing until that day comes. Thanks for watching, and if you want to see more of these challenges, make sure to let me know.